I'm going to take a walk now, and you're going to come with me. We are headed to a place I am almost afraid to think about, the place I know well. We are going to walk the river in the forest around my cottage here on the southern flank of Dartmoor. If I am lucky, I am in the middle of my life, and I am in an enjambment of loss and fatigue. So I go walk about, see what comes. Well, welcome to the Common Toad podcast. I've just read a bit from an as yet unreleased book called Bard's Skull, which has been written by my guest today. His name is Martin Shaw. He is a writer, a mythologist, teacher, a rite-of-passage guide. He's the director of the Westcountry School of Myth in the UK. He originated and led the oral tradition course at Stanford University. And perhaps most crucially, he lived in a tent for 4 years. So I don't know which of those accolades you hold dearest to your heart, but in any case, we're delighted to have him. And we're going to talk about myth and story today. We're going to talk about Christian stories and pagan stories and their coincidence. We're going to talk about some of those who tend the flame for story, I think, and who they might be. But first, I just wanted to, first of all, thank you for coming on. And secondly, just start off by just asking a question about being a storyteller yourself. What is it like to walk into a room of expectant people and tell a story? And what is the nature of that? What is the nature of being a storyteller? So I thought maybe you could just start that way.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you for having me. Enormous question. On the most visceral level, the half an hour or so before you enter a room to tell a very old story is usually not pleasant for anyone, because you're Jacob wrestling with the angel and you're going to be defeated. Mm-hmm. You are Jonah in the mouth of the whale. Something bigger than you. You are in the presence of something that is bigger than you and is going to make your legs buckle. And so it's always humbling, actually. No one swaggers onto the stage, not really, because you really don't want it to be a stage. You want it to be a temenos. You want it to be a place set apart. You want it to be a place of transformation. And so you have to give yourself over to the tale at that moment. Now, that's going to make you neurotic for the first 1,000 times you try and do it. And most storytellers frantically overcompensate. But bit by bit, going through one genial disaster after another, you calm down and you start to allow the story to announce itself through you. Now, that doesn't mean you don't display plenty of personality, because your life is inexorably tied up in it, in the same way that Howling Wolf's life is tied up with the song he'd be singing, or John Lee Hooker. You know, if there's no relationship between the teller and the tale, there's no psychic energy in the story, and the thing is a stuffed bird, it won't fly. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of nausea, a lot of panic, a lot of sense of I'm not worthy for this, especially if it's a story that's going to take me 3 or 4 days to tell. And it's a tightrope walk. There's a real difference between a telling and a recital. And what I've just described to you is so alarming for most people. Very quickly, what they do with their stories is they turn them into recitals. So they
made me nervous just you saying that. Actually, you know, it's a lot like stand-up comedy, I suppose, in that way, right? I mean,
it is. And I look at people like Dave Chappelle and Billy Connolly and others. Mm-hmm. I see a lot of the oral tradition in it, and I love that. And it's a kind of tightrope walk. So if you're interested, like I am, I was never interested in being a kind of an entertainer particularly, or a raconteur. I just wanted to explore what happened when you took your imagination for a walk in public.
Yeah.
And also, I wanted to see what that looked like when you were rooted to a tradition that was really deep and really old, which
Mhm.
oral storytelling is. I was just watching and really enjoying Jay-Z in an interview, his first interview in ages, and the guy was saying to him, "How do you see yourself?" And he said, "Well, I'm a storyteller, of course. You know, it comes out in different mediums, but I'm a storyteller." And I think that's healthy.
Yeah.
One of the little caveats I often give for people is, and this is not original to me, this is an old idea, is that we're not all storytellers, but we're all story carriers. So
Yeah.
in other words, at some point, you're going to have to deal with the detritus of your own life and learn to carry that in a way that in the end is of service to other people. That's how we get built into human beings. So we're all involved in story carrying to some degree or another. But it's a frightening process preparing. I'm better in front of bigger crowds than smaller crowds. That's a
Yeah.
thought that I've had. It's nothing to do with ego. It's to do with the amount of energy that I like to push out when I'm telling. And if it's a small crowd, it'll incinerate them. But if there's 300-400 people, then I get a kind of an energetic response
Yeah.
that lets me know, okay, we're dancing now. They're not just in a furnace. But the thing that it's interesting, you know, someone we have in common, I'm sure we'll mention later, is Malcolm Guite.
Yeah.
And the thing about Malcolm's head is filled with, you know, 600-700 poems. My head is filled with 600-700 stories.
Yeah.
I was thinking about, I thought, why don't I learn to recite stories in that word by word thing, that wonderful thing that Malcolm does. And I thought, well, the space is just already occupied with Gilgamesh or Parsifal or the Odyssey or the Red Bead Woman or Old Kitna.
Well, you sort of answered the second part of what I was saying too, which I was going to ask, which was, you know, was there a connection? I wanted to talk about the role of fear in the storyteller, and is there a connection to that experience of getting in front of people to talk and to tell a story, and the common theme within a story of being or going into the underworld or into the wilderness? I don't know if you've been to the underworld. You have been in the wilderness a lot in your life, right? Is there a connection there? Somebody who's tempted towards the sort of chaotic potential of the underworld or forests of stories, and just the experience of fear that you feel bringing other people along for it?
I think that different stories magnetically attract different storytellers.
Yeah.
And there are some that are innately jovial, and that's wonderful. But the ones I always look for do you know what, you probably know what Samuel Beckett's face looks like?
I can picture it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a hawk there with these late Samuel Beckett black and white photos. They're fantastic. And you want to see someone that, as my friend as a comedian, Tommy Tiernan, says, you want to see someone where you feel some of the decisions they've made in their life are now eked on their face.
Well, that's what George Orwell said. By the age 50, everyone has the face they deserve, right? So yeah. Maybe that does have some truth to it.
So I think, you know, I think the underworld thing is interesting because without that, the group can't sink down. The Irish have a phrase, how can I be with you if I'm not sad? And I've just been teaching my summer school where we've had 70 of us for 5 days from all over the world in this old Agatha Christie-esque little house on the edge of Dartmoor. And the best we can hope for on day 3 or 4 is a lot of tears.
Yeah.
And then the elegance of managing to do that in public without thinking you've made a terrible misstep. So part of it is the teller's capacity to go down, stay down, but there's also an ancient covenant with storytelling, and it's I will show you every single kind of monster that you're going to face in your life. Every underworld tale does that, but I make a covenant with you here and now. I will get you out of this. And not only will I get you out, I will get you out at a tempo that doesn't give you the bends. And I think a lot of modern art is pretty good at taking us down to the underworld, but modern art is not necessarily filled with the kind of magicians required to understand the architecture of that experience to then get us out again. So we actually end up, as Victor Turner would say, not in the liminal at all, but the liminoid.
Well, this is a great point, and I should say the reason that we're having this conversation now at all, and the reason that I became interested in some of your work is because I recently saw the conversation that you had with Mark Vernon, which is really one of the best ones I'd heard in a while. And I'll link to it when I post this, and if people haven't seen it should watch it. And one of the things, you talked about a lot of things, but one of the things you talked about was myth telling and the first person. And you made the point that nowadays, a lot of times, a story that's popular stories, that we still have this fascination with myth and with old stories, but there's this tendency to become the god, or to tell the story in the first person instead of the third. And it made me think of why that might be, and what was at work in our modern or postmodern minds. It reminds me of the filmmaker Werner Herzog's dictum. He said that a house with every light on is uninhabitable. You don't want to live in a house with every light on, but there's this tendency that we have to try to break every story and persona down into its constituent parts and inhabit that. But you said it, you do lose something doing that, right? There's a sort of ego involved in trying to become something other instead of letting it radiate out towards you.
Yes, that's exactly the problem in the end. I'm not entirely indisposed to it. It's an effective thing to do. I've done it myself in books. But in the end, when you really enter deep myth, in the same way you enter deep ceremony or deep religion, it is a mistake to assume that intimacy is the highest goal. How are you doing? That your back is being perpetually rubbed as you're experiencing Beowulf, for example. It's all part of modernity, and with mythology around our feet most of the time in bits. The only form we'll accept is one that comes up and backs up the religion of ourselves.
Yeah.
Whereas these stories don't come from that kind of consciousnness at all. So the story survives in a way, but we run the risk of the thing becoming more and more anemic, more self-centered in a very unhelpful fashion. Yes, so it's that word I used, it's very popular these days, phenomenology. Let the thing be the thing. Stop telling the stories what they are. I have to say, in a bit of a critique of my own discipline of mythology, I see a lot of people these days, I don't see enough storytelling. I see too much commentary on those stories. And what that means is you've replaced the encounter with the theory about the encounter, and that's always a safer place to be. Mm-hmm. It's always safer. Oh, at last I have a map. And I offer this as a caution in my own work and anyone else. Don't tell a story and then turn to people and say, and this is what it means. You've insulted the story, and you've insulted the baptism of their own imagination within that story. The question could just be, where do you find yourself in it? And then what happens is you're in the process of a living myth rather than a lecture.
Where do you find yourself in it? Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Because that kind of takes care of, I guess an answer to that would be, well, we live in a different society now, and we don't necessarily want to take up the burden imposed on us by our ancestors. We have different ways of doing things, and some of those ways are for the better. Some people would say that most of those ways are for the better, all that sort of thing. But I suppose the problem is that reduces it to a morality play, whereas what you're saying is these old myths are a lot more than just that. They're not telling us a moral tale in the same way that we tell ourselves moral tales now. It's more of a world or something.
Yes, the trouble with having done this for a long time when it comes to myth is that for every argument I give, I immediately could give you a counter argument.
Yeah.
just as valid. But the thing, I think one of the questions is, for a myth to remain living, it's not healthy just to refer to it as a stuck moment in time, but it's actually a movable feast. For example, if you look at the Arthurian tradition, which we all tend to assume is firmly rooted in the Celtic world, there's actually an enormous Islamic influence that comes in with the courtly romances. It could even be that some of the deep interior myths of the Arthurian world that come through in the 6th century have roots in the Caucasus. And so one of the questions I've asked over the years is, well, who has copyright on such a tale? Because it's still exfoliating in the heart of a young girl living in Portland, Oregon. She has as much purchase on that story as anything that's happened since its beginning. It remains alive. So I have to be careful because on the one hand, I do pay enormous amount of attention to what anthropologists call the life world that story comes from. Now, the reality is, it seems that some stories have an organically migratory tendency. They're built to travel. And then you get the other stories that are distinctly regional, and they are to be told within the context of the contours of a particular river, next to a particular tree. They are slow ground stories. They're stories of place, but they're not the only ones that exist. We have the phenomena of stories of women giving birth to bears, for example, in Russia, but also in Mexico. How does that happen? Is it diffusion? Is it collective unconscious? What's going on there? It's fascinating.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, I was going to say too, before we start talking about some of your more recent discoveries of Christian stories, what is your experience generally, just geographically? Have you studied traditions all over the world, or did you have a particular place in mind when you started this?
No, I didn't. I haven't. I have a sort of a general idea, but I never wanted to have knowledge that was 3 miles wide and 2 inches deep. I wanted something that was more site specific. So I have spent probably most of my time very focused in on the fairy tale tradition, the Arthurian, the Irish, because that's my bloodline effectively. I'm an Anglo-Irish teller, really. So I imagine in the years that I'm allowed, I'll probably go further and further in that direction. I'm off to Donegal in a couple of weeks to start learning how to speak Gaelic. So that's where my attention is. But I also have a deep love, interestingly, of Siberian myth and stories. And it's funny, my great uncle was a man called Hamer Broadbent, who spent time in Siberia and Transylvania. He wrote If You Were Plymouth Brethren. This is a very influential book I'm about to mention. It will mean nothing to almost everyone else. My great uncle wrote a book called The Pilgrim Church, which is about the migrations of the church, really. I don't think Hamer would necessarily approve of some of my current spiritual leanings, but he didn't like priests. He didn't approve of it. He didn't like what he called priestcraft. He said it's getting in the way. And by that point, Hamer had seen a lot of corruption in the church and was saying, look, we need to get into a more direct encounter with what he would have thought of as the Holy Spirit.
Well, that dovetails nicely with what I was going to ask you next, which was one of the things that for me, the big thing that you talked about with Mark Vernon was this new experience that you have had with Christianity itself and Christian story and the uncovering. I mean, you talk about the Irish traditions, and there's some wonderful stories that are uncovered from the fairly early on that you feel like you can work with now. I don't want to go through the whole story because you told it beautifully with Mark, but just give a little snippet and just tell us there's been something that's changed about your view on Christianity and the stories inside that whole realm.
Yes, of course. Well, I grew up. I've grown up in a very useful, healthy Christian dialogue for 50 years because my family, they're not Sunday Christians. Let's put it that way. And my mum and dad are what you would call probably. I don't think they'd mind me saying this, nonconformist, in a way. It keeps them lively. You
Yeah.
know, they're very connected to Scripture. They're very connected to a sort of immediate, constant deepening into Christ, really. And that, as is always the case, as a child, there's often a limit to how much of that you can absorb or understand. And so as I got older, I moved away from Christianity. It was an evangelical strand and also the charismatic movement that I just wasn't ready to absorb it. So I've
Yeah.
been on a long journey, hugely nourishing, hugely powerful and informative journey. First, by living in a black tent for 4 years to explore the gospel of the wilderness, not the gospel necessarily that was in the book.
Mhm.
If I was going to give myself to Christ, I would see Christ everywhere, not just on a Sunday in a book. It
Mhm.
had to be a deeper consciousness that had to be a more mystical reality. And I couldn't find that at the time. And then as I was approaching turning 50, as I am now, I ended up on a long 101 day vigil where I was going to a forest every day at dusk and just giving thanks. And during that process, somehow, astonishingly, I realized that within the deep interior of myself, as near to me as my own breath, this figure from my childhood, this mossy wild beast called Christ, was announcing himself. And at this stage, with all the disappointments and pain that life offers, you'd be very foolish not to take an invitation like that.
Yeah.
So although it has caused me, nothing I've ever done has caused me this amount of shit.
You're joking.
Yeah.
Not everybody just said, "Oh, well, that's wonderful for you."
Yeah. No, friendships, poof.
Yeah.
Massive, massive degrees of misunderstanding, uh, which I knew was going to be par for the course.
Sure.
But that's really it. I went out into the bush and I encountered very profoundly the spiritual reality of my childhood. And interestingly, it was a kind of exfoliation. It was an accomplishment of everything that I've encountered in these myths and stories for years. It wasn't opposed to it or oppositional to it. It was a kind of a beautiful announcement of it somehow.
Yeah.
So that put me into shock,
Yeah.
I've just been lying relatively low for the last 7 or 8 months and coming to terms with the fact that some elements of my life have profoundly changed. You know what it's like when you get to the middle age, you're really looking subconsciously to be around conversations that confirm roughly what you already think.
Yes.
And when something really comes along that does not do that, that
Yeah.
pushes you into ground where you go from being a teacher absolutely to a kid, you're very vulnerable. And and as they say, and the eagle attracts the hunter, and the sharks start to swarm around you because they see that you're vulnerable. So it's a hugely exciting but absolutely new ground for me.
Well, let's pause for a moment on this. I mean, you talk about how, nothing like this has ever kind of had such an explosive effect on your life. And there is this, I was thinking of it before as this wall between, it feels like this wall between the Christian culture, which really is a culture that we, whether we know it or not, live and breathe in, but there's this, and then there's we put over here, what would earlier be called pagan stories or stories from other traditions or older traditions. And it seems like crossing over from one to the other gets people not, it doesn't get them angry necessarily, sometimes angry, but sometimes it gets them very just agitated in general. And thinking about what, I mean, I was imagining this as a wall, and then I came across this part from Chesterton in Orthodoxy, and I'm just going to read it and have you respond to it if you could. It's let's see if I can find it. Yeah, so he says the outer ring of Christianity is a rigid guard of ethical abnegations and professional priests, but inside that inhuman guard, you will find the old human life dancing like children and drinking wine like men. For Christianity is the only frame for pagan freedom, but in the modern philosophy, the case is opposite. It is its outer ring that is obviously artistic and emancipated. Its despair is within. And I wonder if people are, first of all, what do you think about that? But also, what are the reactions, the strong negative reactions that you found, did they have to do with people interacting with this outer ring that they think of as the whole of Christian culture and teaching?
Yeah, it's a lot of people have had blisteringly unpleasant experiences of Christianity,
Right.
and they're aware of the very real, scandals attached to the church, and the feeling that this seems very kind of male-centered, and all the words are male and masculine. And I quite understand why you think, well, I just don't need that. Also, we're living in a time, we really are living in a time of enormous climate emergency. And so even though actually, if you go through the Bible, literally forensically line by line, there's enormous love of the earth, love of the planet, love of animals, love of our relationship with all of that. I think it needs to be restated to some position, which is why, and we can get into this later, I'm so excited about a lot of the Celtic and Gaelic stories I've been exploring that quite organically have an effusive, celebratory, invitational experience of what David Abram calls the more than human world.
Yeah.
But basically, yeah, people just go, I don't want to go near that. Why would I need to go? Why do I need that when I can gobble on ayahuasca and see everything in 45 minutes? Thank you very much.
So there's obviously
we're paralyzed. There's almost a tyranny to the degree of choice that we are now facing in terms of our spiritual tapas.
Yeah. So, well, the kind of almost fear of Christianity that you kind of described by some is in some ways, is in some ways a reflection of the fear that Christianity itself seems to project sometimes. I mean, the real Christianity, you have to think, mustn't be afraid of the underworld. It shouldn't be afraid of depth. It shouldn't be afraid of seeing something good and true in other pre-Christian or other stories. That's a sign of weakness, surely. So,
yeah, I mean, we only have to think of Augustine. All truth is God's truth.
Yeah.
All truth is God's truth. It's not as if some would disagree with him, but it cannot be that for the thousands and thousands and thousands of years towards the piece of history that we call the Bible, there weren't endless pinpricks of the eternal showing up in cultures all around the world.
Right.
And certainly for me, I found an absolute suffusion. I haven't found the figure of Christ, but I found Christ-like attributes in many, many indigenous cultures and stories, and they nourish me hugely.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about those? I mean, what have you found so far? Stories that you maybe didn't expect to find in this world, stories that really enchanted you or got you as excited as any that you would come across. Have you been looking into those now?
Yeah, I have. I mean, I think that, of course, we all remember that the beginning of John, and that attention on that word logos.
Yeah.
And I know that my work, my tiny contribution in this conversation about the event of Yeshua, really, my tiny part of it is to talk about the mythos, not really the logos. I want to talk about the dreaming, not the visioning, because we already have thousands of books about the visioning. We have lots of daytime logic about Christianity.
Right.
That's just not what I'm here wired to do. Other people do that far, far better than I do. So I'm looking for the stories, the wonderful, of course, the reality of the Eastern Orthodox understanding of really why Christ is on the cross. He descends into an underworld journey right in the middle of, he's a busy boy between Friday and, he goes right down into the center of the underworld and comes back, breaks open the gates of hell, Adam and Eve, the whole thing.
Yep.
Profoundly mythic, profoundly alive in a way. So I have just been, it always happens to me organically. I don't have a thought about it. I don't set out like an ambition, but immediately this interior conversation, this announcing presence of Yeshua turned up. Stories started to turn up. Strange things happened. People would just push books through my front door without any explanation, filled with stories about, for example, there's a bell that St. Patrick gives one of his students. And he says, when the bell rings, you will know that is where you are to build your community. And the lad walks through Ireland and he comes to all these beautiful glades and wonderful places you'd want to build a community and a chapel and lots of people. And then gradually the mood changes and the sky gets darker and he enters a dark, dark forest where there's no people and a low mist and the hooting of owls. And yes, sure enough, ding 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 ding, the bell rings, and the lad has to create his community in the deep dark forest. And his first disciples, his first students, his first fellow believers are, a boar, a wolf, a fox. They're the ones. It's the animal powers that you have to negotiate with, both inside us, but also outside there in the world. That is electrifying to me.
Yeah.
So the question I have for myself at the moment is, have I heard Patrick's bell ring yet? Do I know where I've got to build my chapel? Because there's plenty of wonderful places in Marin County I could build it, but I need to wait till I hear the deep bell ring. And even if it's a forest that I'm scared of, even if I'm surrounded by creatures that may or may not wish me well, that's where I have to do my work.
This idea of, talking animals and little localized stories and things like this might be something that, some look at and say, I don't know, I don't recognize that as kind of a Christian story. It sounds to me more like something that I'd hear from Native American tales or Celtic tales or something like that. Yeah, go ahead.
It's worth bearing in mind that to the Irish, for a long time, their version of the their Old Testament would have been stories of Cuchulainn, stories of Finn McCool, stories that are deeply animistic. And so it's not that surprising that when this exotic, strange Middle Eastern religion arrives in Dingle or Connaught or Sligo, they weren't called that then, as they embed themselves, of course, these stories, again, to use that phrase of communicating across species, of a world that is animate, it's the most natural thing that's going to be in the stories, because, we're living in a time where saints are still being born, hermits are still being born, natural sisters and brothers of monastic traditions are still being born. They may just not know it anymore because they're so horrified by what they think the tradition is.
Yeah. Well, imagine, a couple kind of grouchy characters listening to us and kind of just objecting to this kind of blending. So Chris, from either side, either from the atheist or certain versions of Christian side, that says, look, Christianity is it's an unambiguous rejection of paganism and pagan way of life and of local superstition, and your union of the two is some kind of wish thinking, some kind of hybrid that you want to be true, but it's not really possible. You can't really blend these two things. There's Christianity and then there's other stuff, and you go all in on one or not. You and Chesterton and others, you like the pagan carnival. Part of you likes the pagan carnival, so you're just trying to shoehorn it into like a moral framework or something like that. Do you get that sometimes? Have you thought about that objection before?
Of course I have, because for a long time I didn't think I had any need for Christianity.
Yeah.
If you'd interviewed me literally 12 months ago, I would have given a very different sort of interview. So this is all moot unless the unruly spirit is moving through you and forcing you into these connections. I may look as a relatively placid here today, but there's, proper apocalypse going on inside me at the moment. And I'm just barely hanging on to the back of the wolf as this goes on. So that would be my immediate concern. I couldn't give, I must be polite. I'm not flustered by people's, upset and comments, because they're all describing the exterior, not the interior of the situation that I'm in. And from the exterior, I do understand that. And I understand the travesties on both paths. But luckily, as we both know, I'm in vintage company in terms of this way of thinking. Right. And actually, so there's a historic tradition that goes way back that I can draw from. I'm not saying for a moment that I'm saying anything remotely new, but I suspect that my fairly diligent understanding of what happens to people when they go to wild places and sit still really has to say something about an area of Christianity that's got rather moribund and rather safe. And again, a feeling of I'm interested in a kind of Christian dreaming as well as a Christian visioning. Not one isn't better than the other. I just know what I'm good at. I just know I'm based at. So I have not felt for one single second, the typical, I have to say, the typical announcement usually at a baptism is, I've been so terribly lost. Everything's been awful. Now I've been saved. All is well. Thank goodness. An end to that. In I go.
Yeah.
I don't live in that reality. I feel that doesn't mean I haven't been a profoundly wicked individual on occasion, but the things that God has, impacted and placed in front of me are now hugely useful. They don't need to be abandoned. I just have, in medieval alchemy, there's a wonderful phrase, vas bene clausum. It means the well-sealed vessel. And I just have a much better vessel now to understand and explore these sort of drive-by spiritual encounters I've been having for the last quarter of a century.
One thing I had mentioned to you in writing was something that had been tugging at me for the last year or so. And my second conversation I had with Malcolm Geit, which was earlier this year, someone who you know personally, it came on the occasion of his recent book on imagination called Lifting the Veil. I have it somewhere. I do recommend it if people, I have it here actually. I'll hold it up. Very little book, good book, lots of stuff packed right into it.
Really good.
And so I was talking to him about that. We ended up talking about the island of the United Kingdom. It's relatively successful blending of Christian and pagan elements into their very old mythologies. And it was successful compared with, in my view, where I'm from, the Americas, the continent itself. And I wanted to ask him why he thought that was. And we came up with a couple of possible answers for that. Like he said, the state of Christianity at the time of its arrival there versus here. And we talked about the Americans' inability to grapple with the very recent violent past with their native populations. It's kind of put some kind of wall in between their culture and ours to some extent. But there's another kind of almost back door, it seems like, that could be relevant. I've been reading this book here. I haven't finished it, but it's called Orthodox Alaska,
Yeah.
by Michael Alexa, and he's a priest that has been up there for, I don't know, decades and decades, and he has written about a very different experience that the Aleut people, mostly with the native population up in Alaska, have had, compared with a lot of the colonial, frankly, terrors that happened. Europeans landing on the east coast of my continent, and one of the differences was it had some connection to some of the stuff that we've been talking about. I mean, it had something to do with this ability to actually, some of it's just contingent on other things, but just the ability of the Orthodox priests or brothers who came there in the late 18th century to sit and listen for, in some cases years, to what the actual natives were saying in Alaska. The phrase they used was they were guests in another man's house. And they ended up having, I think part of their success was because they were able to, the trading that was going on, the fur trading and everything, that was kind of the source of a lot of the oppression that was happening to the Alaskan natives. And the whistleblowers and the people who rightly saw it as immoral were the priests, or was the brotherhood up there, was the church. I don't know if you know anything about the history of that and the stories of peoples up there, but I wonder if there are some inherent differences in the world of the Orthodox Church, which maybe lent it to be more understanding, be more interested even in, or just less afraid of other stories and other traditions, and how they were able to just kind of not absorb it, but to invite it in and to keep a lot of those traditions. Whereas, you see some of the accounts of, the separatists or Puritan cultures, individuals, sure, but in general, they didn't have much time for that kind of thing.
Mm. I think the important word that you just described is fear. Fear-based religion is a ghastly thing to be in the presence of, especially when it's announcing itself to a new culture.
Mm.
I think everybody intrinsically understands that you'd have to be mad as a missionary to turn up and think that God didn't get there first.
Well, that's a great way to put it. Yeah, I mean, that kind of sums it up.
Just how could that not be? So would you not want to sit down and watch how Christ radiates through the stories and their ways of being, in their very quiet ways as well as their ceremonial? Yes, I mean, everything. The thing about Orthodoxy, and I'm absolutely no authority on it, I'm a baby in the waters.
Yep.
The place to be. But that, I saw a T-shirt recently that said Orthodoxy, keeping it real since AD 33. Or in other words, they're not necessarily, they may not be the most threatened, they're not threatened. They know exactly who they are. And that's something that you do encounter, I do feel, with Orthodox Christians. There's just a kind of a quiet confidence to them. They know where they are, and they know, the divine liturgy really does something. It does something. It is forensic in the way it scrubs the soul. And the last time I had an experience with other people that was as deep as the divine liturgy, I was in a sweat lodge with Wallace Black Elk 25 years ago. Now, Wallace was the grandson of Nicholas Black Elk of Black Elk Speaks.
Wow.
And Wallace was the guy, he said, look, we've had, the little hippie guy, as he called him. The little hippie guy was here too. The Lakota, we have our own stories about him. So although, of course, I am the first in the queue in terms of, a heart-rending sorrow at the Luciferic elements of the quote-unquote Christian missionaries that came. It's the opposite. At the same time, And it happens actually in the story, The Voyage of Brendan, when Brendan and his mates really finally arrive in the new world. They meet a being that's standing there saying, well, I was waiting. You've got a few days, then you have to return. And, sure. I mean, that's a Choctaw or a Ojibwe or a Miwok.
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
is. It absolutely is. And I can't help but feel in the pickle, it's people call, I do say this respectfully for many of my Christian friends, we talk about the church as the mystical body of Christ, but the vital organs in that body spend all their times arguing with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Kidneys arguing with the heart, but the liver packs up, we've had it. And I do wish that for all people can we just not remember we're Christians? Could we not spend a year in a day and every single church worship in a tent again? Every single church, whatever your denomination, for 1 year, take an animal as one of your significant teachers. Why is church not like attending Camelot? What has happened? Where is the sense of vocation have gone? Where's the electricity has gone? Where's the excitement gone? These are just early feelings for me, but I know, many people are deeply involved with this.
Well, maybe this brings us to John Moriarty. I mentioned earlier, trying to think about who some of the storytellers or mystics or guides that exist either in our time or relatively recently, who they might be to help us navigate the world that we live in. And one of them, maybe one possible key figure, it seems to me, might be the Irish figure John Moriarty. Now, you were involved in editing. You were the editor of a reader of his, and I'll hold that up because I've been poking through this, called "The Hut at the Edge of the Village," edited by Martin Shaw, and with a foreword by Tommy Tiernan, who is Jerry in Dairy Girls, as it turns out, right?
Yeah.
People might know him better from that.
Yeah.
But the two of you have, and a few others have spent some time, an effort to try to get more people to know about this guy, right? And maybe it would just be good for you to say who he was and really who he was. Like, what was he? Was he a poet? Was he a what kind of a character was he? He was a wild character. And when you talked about the church sometimes squabbling amongst itself, and the organs of the church squabbling amongst themselves, I picture over somewhere on the edges is John Moriarty saying, I can be a Christian God, but I have to be a wild bush. You have to let me be a wild river or something like that. I have to be out there. Maybe you can talk about him a bit.
Yeah, I can talk about John. John was a Kerry man, lived till I think his very, very late 60s, died maybe 13, 14 years ago. Most of his life, I think, a little tortured, little tortured. As Campbell would say, the role of the community is to torture the mystic to death. And there was a bit of torture, I think, going on for him, although he certainly in Ireland picked up something of a following in his last 15 years. But a lot of the time he earned a living as a gardener. He was able to, I remember he gave what in his mind was a very well-paid talk. I think he earned 3,000 euros and possibly eked that out for several years to live on. So this is a man that never in his life, he never hit the ka-ching button. He was never franchised. Interestingly, he was very much along the same line, not a different person. It was the same time John O'Donoghue became very popular with his book Anam Cara, that was a big seller and was huge. John was on the road and unfortunately died very unexpectedly as quite a young man. But Moriarty grew up in a rural Catholic setting, then moved out into the philosophies and the mythologies of the world. He went over to Canada and became a lecturer, but then found he yearned to return to Ireland. But, John had been putting his stick into a big pile of medicine for a long time, and that does something to you. He was sort of rewired by the time he returned to his little Catholic community. And the trouble is, in this life, good conversation is hard to find. And I think it was hard for John to find people to talk to. And the way John managed to communicate most effectively to fairly straightforward rural folk was through his storytelling. It wasn't actually through his writing, it was his storytelling. And I have lost count of the amount of Irish folks that I've met now that said, I could not really make head nor tail of his books. But when John told a story, I was absolutely gripped.
Yeah.
And his books are tough country after a while. I would suggest, if anyone's interested in John, to begin with the book that you have in your hand, and then go out towards a book called Dreamtime, a book called Invoking Ireland, and then if you really take a deep breath, read his massive biographies that begin with a book called Nostos.
I've dipped into Nostos a little bit. It is massive, and not just in page count either. I mean, it's just filled every page with references of all kinds of stories and things that he's written. I mean, that he's read over the course of his life. It's very dizzying. I'll read just something that you have, a couple sentences you have in your introduction to him. You said I was fully grown by the time I came to Moriarty. Well into my second book, I knew what erudition felt like on the page. I'd sat for thousands of hours in wild places, 4 years in a tent, been broken open by the mysteries and left gasping. But what I had not encountered in a Western writer was the chant. What is the chant of John Moriarty?
It's something you'd actually have to listen, go on YouTube or buy one of the. There's a tempo. There's a tempo and a music to the way John spoke orally and on the page. That's the sense of the chant, the sense of the sacred announcing itself, the kind of heightened tension and arresting of the moment in his linguistic skills, in the way he spoke. If you hear John talk, you quickly realize that what he's writing is in absolute simpatico to how he speaks and thinks. That's not normal for writers.
Yeah, right.
Writers are terribly introverted, and all the work really happens on the page. It is a very, very rare thing when someone is also a mesmeric communicator and can write as well. But if you read the introduction that Tommy Tiernan gives to that book, he says, I like the books, but you've got to hear him. You've got to hear him. And there's actually Lilliput Press that put out the Moriarty book, have a set of recordings. I think it's called One Night in Eden. It's expensive, but it's worth it. And that will get you through a cold winter.
If people have their interest piqued by this, I would say read the story, Big Mike, that is in the beginning of this book, but maybe listen to it, because that is on YouTube, that segment of him telling his story, Big Mike. And it's not verbatim. It's not, you can compare the two too, which is kind of interesting. He's just retelling it seemingly from memory in the audio. But if you look up on YouTube, Big Mike, you will see exactly what Martin is talking about in terms of the chant and the cadence. And I find it's a gift. I mean, because once you have it in your head, it's in your head and you can use it to read everything that he's written. I mean, I can now hear his voice, and I've barely dipped in, but I can now hear his voice every time I pick this up and go through different things. And yeah, I mean, what is the difference there? You talk about how most writers are introverted and their voice really comes on the page. It's not identical with the spoken word. I mean, clearly he's tapping into something that felt different. It feels older. Is this more in line with an old story? Let me ask it this way: did he do that because he was such a just by chance such a strange and different kind of a person, or do you think that there's some kind of experiences that he had that allowed him to tap into something in the old tradition of storytelling like that, or maybe it's part of Ireland? I don't know.
Although John does create a doorway in his writing for visionary experiences that he had,
Yeah.
I suspect he was just naturally brilliant. Everything, you know, I've read everything Moriarty has written, published, I've read, and quite a bit of unpublished stuff I've read. And what's interesting to me is some of the unpublished stuff I've read that was a decade before, if not, yeah, at least a decade, maybe two before anything came out. He was already phenomenally accomplished and didn't read like anybody else way back in the 70s. He was quite a young man. So he received something. I think John leaves a phenomenal challenge to anybody that's interested in the wild edges of Christianity, because actually he never got to do what it was he really, really wanted to do, which was to establish a Christian community in Ireland that brought forth the kind of the Dreamtime ideas that he'd been working on, and others.
Wow.
So that still remains as a possibility. Paul Kingsnorth and myself are going over to Benbury Priory in Northern Ireland in November, which I know now, if it's not sold out, it's almost sold out. And there's tons and tons of, you know, priests and thinkers are coming over on ferries and arriving and coming out of dingles and dells to continue this conversation with, well, what do we do with it?
Yeah.
You might remember, I say it in the introduction, that a lot of what's in that Moriarty book, there was no digital copy of it. So I had to type it out from his massive books. That was a very deep experience. It lasted about 3 months.
Wow.
And probably, I wouldn't want to put the blame on him entirely. I would have thought probably had some sort of influence in the sort of the dimensions of Christianity that were starting to open up for me. Although I occasionally wished he could get to the bloody point a bit quicker than he does.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, there's an essential catastrophe at the heart of, you could tell that's at the heart of his being. And he opens, like I said, I've only read a little bit of this, but he opens, this is Nostos, also by Lilliput Press, which is the same as your reader. But he opens this memoir in a way that was really a bigger, I've never kind of felt a bigger gut punch than what he does here, which is he starts his memoir as a child on Christmas Eve. And he talks about, you know, the lamplight, the firelight. Tonight was different. Looking at the crib and the deep sill of our front window, I could see that the light of the highest heaven was in our house. It was a night of wonders, and Santa Claus would come and bring us what we asked for. There was no denying it. It was wonderful. You know, in a glow of fellow feeling with all our animals, I went out and crossed the yard to the cow stall. And then he goes, pushing open the door, I looked in. At first, I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. No candles lighting in the windows, no holly, no crib, no expectation of kings or angels, no sense of miracles. What I saw was what I would see on any other night: 11 short-horned cows, some of them standing, some of them lying down, some of them eating hay, and some of them chewing the cud, and 2 of them turning to look at me. Devastated, I had to admit, it was an ordinary night in the stall. Coming back across the yard, I looked at the fowl house and the piggery in the darkness, and the silence that had settled on them couldn't say any more clearly: Christmas didn't happen in the outhouses. Christmas didn't happen to the animals. The animals were left out. And since the animals were left out, so inside me somewhere was I. And that, to me, seems to be, without having read much of him yet, seems to be the core of his struggle. All of this depth of feeling, all of this sense of wonder, this feeling of thanksgiving towards something, this kind of unpinpointable glory. Is this something that was, is this a mirage? Is this something that was, I was just told? Is it something that's in my head, or is it beyond? Where is the enchantment for the rest of the world? Where is the enchantment in the forest? Where is the enchantment for the animals? Is that what he was struggling with his entire life, or did he come to an answer?
Yeah, he didn't. It wasn't always a struggle. There's also, and I won't go into it here, you know, I think that there's an ongoing conversation for him about sex that never really resolves itself, and you go further and further in and you hear that in the images he uses to describe coupling and lovemaking. You realize there's a tension in him around that kind of thing, and around the fact that he's very clear. He says, I'm married to divine ground, really.
Yeah.
I'm married to divine ground, which is going to mean that it's going to be no picnic for any woman that's trying to have a relationship with someone who's already sort of gazing half into the, Jacobea and the Desert Fathers and the Rhineland mystics, and all of that's going on in him. I chose to open my anthology of John with that story because I knew it's one people would feel and relate to. And then the book gradually gets more and more difficult as we go.
Mm-hmm.
But I think actually John very quickly, in life, it's not really what happens to us, it's what we do with it. And what he chose to do with those early wounds was explore them thoroughly and come back with what had been a perilous wound. It became a ritual cut. It became an initiatory deepening that he could then bless other people with. And he did, thank God, and we're all the richer for it. So actually, by the time he's in his early 20s, he's wrestling with the big, deep questions of where is the animal soul of Christianity? Because Christ had it. Mm-hmm. How have we gone so far from the true, as the Orthodox call it, the last true rebellion, which is the arrival of Yeshua? Mm. How has this happened? And his mind was vast and very much in the spirit of the comparative mythology of the late 20th century, which I have shied away from. He goes into a lot of Indian mythology. The only thing he leaves alone really is Islam. Mm-hmm. He doesn't really go there. He touches on the edges of Sufism, but that's about it. He doesn't really approach Islam, but by and large, he has a crack at almost anything else, which is going to be liberating for some and terribly frustrating for others.
Just because they don't have any context for it, or
no one. I've been a Stanford professor, and I'm telling you that this stuff is difficult. What he's doing, because often it's not backed up. There often aren't footnotes. Mm-hmm. Within a sentence, he'll reference or quote two or three. He'll go from Blackfoot to Schopenhauer to to Eleanor of Aquitaine, all in a couple of moves. And he's generous in the sense that he expects you to be able to engage in that kind of thought process with him. But most of us, after a while, are wheezing.
Yeah, and that's what's so strange about him is that, one of the other I was happy that you included was the story of him trying to walk his older neighbor home. Someone who who he considered a teacher home from the pub or something. And I don't know how long of a walk it was. It seemed like it lasted a few lifetimes, but you could see, and he had this, obviously he had this great, depth of I don't want to say academic understanding, but to some extent, or knowledge of the wider world and the myths in the wider world. But as you say, he had this such tenderness towards his location and to the people there and to his friendships and to the land. And it's just, with someone that has that kind of uniqueness, is there a way for generally that people can look to him as maybe a guide into their own lives of reanimating or re-enchanting their own worlds? Because ultimately, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about what is it that we're lacking in our contemporary life? What are we lacking in our society that everybody seems to be feeling right now? What is the big hole? And how are we supposed to synthesize our experience, our day-to-day experience, with things that we seem to be longing for?
Well, in the case of John Moriarty, I can sum it up in one sentence, which is useful. What John tells us to do is not to become famous, not to become rich, not to think we should be having any kind of life other than the one we're having, but we have to make the move that all mystics have made from seeing consciousness to beholding consciousness. And when you behold consciousness, it radiates, it has a kind of phenomenal iconography that connects you to what he would call divine ground. We don't need more cars. We don't need more sex. We don't need more money. What we need is to be connected to divine ground. And I'm glad you brought up the image of him walking back from the pub with his friend Martin, because this story, which I won't repeat here, it's you could describe it in 2 minutes if you wanted to.
Right.
John was drunk, Martin was drunk. He sits down, we move on. He sits down, we move on. But by the time you finished it, if you're prepared to take the adventure with Moriarty, which is what he's always inviting you to do, this small domestic journey back from the pub has become a sort of James Joycean epic in which all the great questions about reality and love and betrayal and God have been wrestled with. And what John could do on a day-to-day level was show you the prayer mat, and this is my language now, we're moving into my world, so I have to be careful. Mm-hmm. John showing you the prayer mat that you're kneeling upon, and don't pay too much attention to your neighbor's fields. Look at the ground that only you can occupy, and just keep looking and keep gazing. It's what the Druids used to do until the luminous arrives. And that is the thing. And it is the only thing that reenchants the world.
Some people may walk away from that like the rich young man in the Gospels, disappointed, saying, "Oh, I was hoping I could make a contribution of some money or something instead."
Well, if somebody would like to buy me an enormous house in which I could do my book, that would be fine. But the reality is that, and that's old news. Of course, it's old news, but it's news that we have to rediscover every single day. There are some things that just never lose out, that we need to be perpetually reminded of. And John was very good at that. As I say, so John does two things. He takes the mundane and he makes it luminous. All of us can do that if we change the way we view circumstance. And secondly, John was engaged in an ongoing psychic conversation with John the Baptist, Sylvia Plath, Pseudo-Dionysus, Chesterton, Ted Hughes, it goes on and on. So in other words, what he's telling you is there is an imaginative community around you that isn't dependent on that person being alive. Mm-hmm. You are actually, it is an illusion if you are thinking that you are surrounded by scarcity. You're not.
And one of the great things that Malcolm Guite, who we mentioned earlier, said about this is that sitting in your library, even you're allowing conversations to happen that you are the media, that you are the facilitator of, that couldn't happen across time and space. But just as an aside, when if people don't know who Malcolm Guite is, I've had a couple of conversations with him. You've had an interesting conversation that I think you can find on your Substack, which I should have mentioned earlier, The House of Beast and Vines, which is very good. I've subscribed to it myself. And you have a clip of audio, about 20 minutes or so, of Malcolm at your home, just kind of rambling on in a beautiful way about Christian animism and things like that. When you were talking to Mark Vernon, one of the great things that I was so glad that you said about Malcolm was that he had a first-rate mind, but he had the heart of a lion, I think is the way that you put it. And I thought, yes, that's right. This is the thing that we're supposed to be interested in. We're not just being dazzled by a good memory, not just being impressed by knowledge, stories, even the things that we love, but what does it take to really care about goodness and embodied goodness? And I guess maybe this is, I guess I'll just ask that. I mean, as you grow older, you've collected all of these stories, all of these epics from all over, how do you Do you find that you're looking for goodness more and more, and what that is, and how do you preserve that as a storyteller? Is that something that you can keep at its center?
Yes. You you reach you reach you reach an age, might be younger, might be older, I suppose, for people, but for me, one of the things that was so devastating in this journey into Christianity was to come across what is often known as the Sermon on the Mount, and the bit within it that we call the Beatitudes,
Mm-hmm.
where Christ does a sort of Aikido move to the sort of, go forth and conquer mythologies, where suddenly he's talking about a radical kind of hospitality to elements of the human experience most of us would not like.
Yeah.
And he calls forth in us a humility and a charity that should make us distinctly uncomfortable. I'm endlessly interested in the notion of putting down your nets, because I'm in a net putting down moment in my own life.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a kind of a naturally gritty, do you know the word pugilist?
Yeah.
Yeah,
A fighter.
I'm pugilist and not afraid of confrontation and all of that kind of thing. And that's really reaped dividends in my life. It really has. It's given me a kind of drive. It was useful to leave school with no qualifications. It was useful to work in a factory. It was useful that in a way nothing was expected of me, because it's meant that I've had no plan B. I'm
Mm.
surrounded by people all the time, far more intelligent than I am. They just have far, far too many resources to lie back on
Yeah.
that stops them from really doing their work. There's no urgency, there's no restlessness. And it's interesting for me becoming, I knew Christ had put his hand on me when I was more restless than ever. I didn't fall into a sort of soporific bliss. He did cheer me up for a bit, but by and large, I've remained restless because I see around me all the issues that we're talking about here. So not all stories are allegories, not all stories. I mean, a lot of stories, I think what's so wonderful about them, I always say, don't tell a story till you've seen it through the eyes of the monster.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as you're just right in the middle of it, Galahad heading towards the Grail, you haven't quite understood all the disappointments and intrigues that are kind of moving around it. And when I tell a story, I'll try and see it through a variety of lenses. And that shows you, to use that sort of, that old Jungian phrase, it shows you about the kind of shadow that you stagger along with.
Mm.
My old mentor, Robert Bly, always said, understand your own limp so you don't keep pointing out other people's.
Mm.
And that's really what the stories do. The stories, for me, that I'm so in love with, show me everything about the complexities and the intrigues and the glories of life. But Yeshua, for me, is the one that then shows me how to navigate that.
Yeah.
So that's where I am with it. And that creates a strange fusion, between, I have a, someone said to me recently, they said, you have a pagan soul and a Christian heart. It's as if there's all of this underworld in you, but now it's getting distilled in this area. It's why I spotted that heart consciousness that Malcolm has, but it then comes through the heart
Mm-hmm.
and out to the world. And I have to say that's something that you see in Sufism, and it's something you see in Christianity. The thought of the heart.
Mm-hmm.
Think about the Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me. If I sit there every night and say that, within about 3 or 4 minutes, I realize I'm not speaking it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And the prayer is radiating out from my heart out into this world. I've never experienced that before. And I suppose one of the things that's interesting for me in this journey with Christianity, as someone that's traded and lived by words, I'm becoming as interested in silence as I am language. So I'm getting
Yeah. And you're not alone there, which is interesting. I mean, you mentioned Paul Kingsnorth, another writer who I do, if people don't know him, I recommend. He has a Substack called Abbey of Misrule. I think it's where I first learned of John Moriarty, actually, and he's in a similar situation to you, where he was I think he once said that he was a pagan witch practicing, and he was interested, very involved in the environmental movements and things, and now he's at a point, I don't want to say too similar to you, but in a lot of ways similar. It's certainly an interest in the way that you've turned towards Christianity, to face it, to look at it, and to contemplate it as being a part of yourself. And I just wonder, I mean, and it's not just the two of you, I mean,
Oh, no.
it's something seems to be happening,
So
right? And what do you suppose that is? I mean,
I just think it's the Holy Spirit.
there you go.
Sorry.
But why now?
I don't know. Maybe I'm sure that wild old being never stops. But there's tons of women out there as well. Wonderful female teachers emerging all the time. There is something on the go. I mean, the interesting thing is that Paul and I are actually we're really close friends.
Okay.
And I swear to you, when we met about a decade ago in a pub in Cornwall, a place called Lostwithiel, if someone had walked into that pub and bought us a pint and said, in 10 years' time, both of you will be fully paid up God botherers, I would have put $1,000 on the table for that not being a reality. And I see, I've always loved Paul, and he's been my mate, and he's a brilliant writer, but he is there's a real flow about what he's doing now, and a real sense that he's really doing whatever it is he's meant to be doing, he's doing it. So I'm thrilled to see that. And the trouble with being a Christian is that you become accountable. And at the end of the day, if you are wretched and full of vanity, like both me and Paul are, we have to fess up. And we have to be of service to something that's bigger than our own ego, bigger than our own sense of accomplishment. And for some of us, everybody I look at is holier than I am. Everybody's more saintly. Everybody has more Yeshua in them. It doesn't matter whether they think they're a Christian or not. I can see it.
Yeah.
I wasn't born with that stuff, so I have to work on it. And it's an exciting thing. I think if we're talking in 5 years' time, I predict a lot will happen in the next 5 years. It's gonna be amazing.
Yeah, that's great. You started off by saying how whatever it is, I mean, the storytelling ultimately should be in the service of others. And just mentioning that here again, I wonder now, you've been very generous with your time. I appreciate it. But before I let you go, I want you to just say, are there any things that you are working on now that you'd like to tease or just talk about a bit, and or do you not really know yet exactly what the next step is going to be for you as a storyteller and as a writer?
Well, I'm stepping down from quite a lot of academic work that I've been doing over the last few years.
Yeah.
Create, Yeats called God or Christ the ungovernable mystery, the ungovernable mystery. And I'm in the grip of the ungovernable mystery. So the first thing I realized was that I needed to earn less money and have more space. So I'm in the process of handing that down and just going, okay, where do you want to put me? Well, there's no other question to have. Where do you want to put me? Where, reporting for duty, where do you want me to go? And that requires thinking. So actually, Matthew, the first thing that I'm going to do is go back out into the woods in September. And I'm just going to sit under a tree for 4 days till something happens with no food. I'll do that. So go to the source, have the encounter, come back, digest, pray, think, reflect. That's the big thing in my life. I found a church that I have a good relationship with, and I'm very interested in Orthodoxy. So I'm sort of seeing what that's like. I am working on a book where I'm gathering together under the kind of the title of the project, at least, is Peregrini, because Peregrini is an old Celtic word for the early Celtic Christians. And a peregrini, I always say this, I love it because it has the feeling of a hawk in it, a peregrine.
Yeah.
Also peregrination, a very long walk. And it still feels undomesticated. So I'm doing a lot of writing and a lot of thinking about that. Off to Donegal to start speaking Gaelic.
Wow, yeah, that's right. That's quite a lot.
Yeah, to see, could you reach a point where you dream in Irish? That's my Aboriginal line, you see, or predominantly. I think the potato famine probably got us over here. So rich times, but predominant. I'm a father. I love being a dad. That's my big thing. I love my daughter. It's an amazing time to be alive.
It really is. And there's a lot of contradictions in living this life, including what we're doing now, talking across an ocean, across a massive body of salt water, about the importance of locality. But I totally agree with it, and I totally feel it. And whenever I do go out into the woods, and whenever I do pay attention to place and landscape and learn more about it, learn what the ghosts I'm walking past and have been, I always have the sense that I need to be doing more of it. I need, and maybe that is a way in. I feel like for a lot of people, talking about meaning in those terms, I think on some level, so many people have this sense that that is what's necessary. And we'll see. Maybe we're maybe in for globally feeling a lot of pain, so people are going to have to retreat anyway into that kind of way. Hopefully it's a mindful retreat if it is. But I, for one, am very interested to see where you go with this. I think you have a unique set of skills, just in terms of being a storyteller, in terms of having a good sense of what a story is, about different traditions. And I think whether you mean to or not, just a natural honesty about it. So that's good for people watching, So I'm very interested to see where you head with it. And I just want to thank you very much indeed for coming on the podcast and talking with us today.
I really appreciate that, Matthew, and thank you for mentioning, before I forget, Substack, House of Beasts and Vines.
Yes,
that is the place where what it's like. Writing a book could be years before it comes out, but the joy of Substack is sharing what's really happening at the desk or in your heart at the time. So please, if you like this, come check it out.
Yeah, I concur with that. Absolutely. And take care, and I'll hope to talk to you again another time. Take care.